Hey guys, in this video we're going to look at the circle of fifths, which is the most important pattern in all of music. And I'm going to show you how it really applies to both the piano and the guitar. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't really understand the circle of fifths. There's a lot of misconception about this. It seems like this abstract, ethereal thing. So I'm going to show you some diagrams and some visuals that really break it apart so you know exactly what it is and how you can use it in practical terms. So by the end of this video, you will know it inside and out. So to start, the circle of fifths is usually depicted like this as a ring of letters, where at the top you have C, and then moving in a clockwise direction you have G, D, A, E, B, and so on, moving through all 12 notes or keys of music in a ring like this. Or sometimes it's depicted as a ring of key signatures, music notation showing the different sharps and flats that are in each of the different keys. Now I'm going to explain that more as we go, but let me say here, if this is all you thought of as the circle of fifths, then you'd be pretty limited in your understanding, and it really would seem confusing. This is how I first saw the circle of fifths, and I thought it was pretty complicated. It's actually not, so let's look at how it's built to really understand why it's called the circle of fifths in the first place. The circle of fifths is really just the 12 notes of the chromatic scale, but laid out in a special order. And it's built from major scales. So for example, we have the chromatic scale, piano keyboard here, and we're going to build different major scales and see how they're connected, and it essentially forms the circle of fifths. So starting on C, for example, we have a pattern of whole step, half step, whole step, half step, or C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Now we can refer to this same note pattern using scale degrees or numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Notice how the fifth note of that pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is G. And if we play that same pattern of whole steps and half steps starting on G, we get the G major scale. G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. And using scale degrees, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The fifth note of the G major scale is D, so if we start on D and play another major scale, we've got D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The fifth note of D major is A, so we could play an A major scale using that same pattern. And when we go through this same connection between scales, we get what's called the circle of fifths. These scales overlap to form a circle that highlights intervals of a fifth. It's a circle of fifths. And this ring of scales basically shows how all 12 keys are connected. They overlap, they share some notes. Every major scale shares some notes with those on either side in this ring. And while this is cool, the next question is, how do we use this information? This pattern that is just now staring us in the face. Well, at first it still seems sort of strange because it's this strange sequence of letter names. C, G, D, A, E, and so on, which doesn't really seem intuitive. There's no words in language that are really formed from these letters. So some people use mnemonics to memorize the order. And while that's sort of cute, we're going to transcend the mnemonics to really understand what we're looking at here. Because there's a better way to picture these relationships and see the order that's at play here, and that is to use the color wheel, because just as all keys overlap, all major scales overlap in the circle of fifths, all colors in the color wheel bleed into each other. So it forms this seamless connection between all colors, like there's a seamless connection between all keys in music. So we can use the familiar natural patterns of sight, color, to understand the otherwise confusing or abstract patterns of sound, music. Okay, so now that you can actually see the circle of fifths using the color wheel in a more intuitive and natural way that represents how all of this pattern is formed in the first place, now we come to the critical point. So if you remember anything from this video, it is this. This pattern right here, C, G, D, A, E, etc., can represent different things. It can represent entire keys, which we'll look at in a moment. It can also represent chords. These can represent chords, which again we'll look at in a moment. Or these can represent notes. And we're going to start with that one because it's really, really interesting. Like I said, these are the same 12 notes of the chromatic scale, but rearranged in a different sequence. So if the circle of fifths is basically a color wheel where each note is next to its closely related neighbors, then what would it look like if we rearrange the notes, these notes, back into the chromatic scale? How would we even do that in the first place? Well, check this out. I'm going to show you something cool because it's actually super simple. You just take every other note in the circle of fifths, so all of these notes, for example, and then rotate that set of notes 180 degrees, and the circle of fifths turns into the chromatic scale. So let's do that again to really see what just happened. We start with the circle of fifths, which is the color wheel, since all of these keys are closely connected to each other, and then swap each pair of complementary colors so that they switch places. It forms this scrambled pattern that is the chromatic scale. But now with the color, all of the close relationships in the circle of fifths are still visible, they're just in a different order. So remember, in the circle of fifths, C and G, for example, are right next to each other. In the chromatic scale, they're separated, but that close connection between those notes remains, and you can still see it. So on a piano keyboard, for example, you have the C note and the G note, or red and red-orange. And when we play them together, they form a nice harmony. We throw in the E note, C, E, and G, and we have the C major chord. And it works the same way for all of the notes. So, for example, if we take the G note, red-orange, and play its fifth, D, orange, together they form a nice harmony. We throw in the major third, or B, and we have the G major chord. Or just to try another one, let's start with A flat, and you see its fifth note is E flat, so we have blue and blue-purple, and we throw in the major third, which is C in this case, and we have the A flat major chord. And like I say, all of the notes follow the same pattern because the connection between the circle of fifths and the chromatic scale is consistent and symmetrical. So once you see it for one pair of notes, it works for all of the others. It's really cool that way. And what's nice is that now the circle of fifths isn't just some abstract diagram that you have in your mind's eye. You can actually see these connections with your own eyes because they're right there. They're baked into the instrument itself. All right, so the first way to use the circle of fifths is to see this pattern as the 12 notes of music arranged into a special sequence that you can use to inform how those notes relate to each other. Another way to use the circle of fifths is to think of this sequence as a series of chords. So for example, the C note can represent C major, the C major chord. The G note can represent G major, and then D major, A major, E, B, and so on through all of the different chords in the circle of fifths in order, and you can keep cycling through all of these chords like that. And we can use these relationships in the circle of fifths to inform the chords you use to create some really cool chord progressions. So for example, let's play in the key of B flat. The B flat major chord is what's called the tonic, or the chord of resolution, the main chord in there. And if we use the circle of fifths, you can see that just to the right in a clockwise direction is the fifth chord, the major 5 chord, which in this case is F major. And then counterclockwise from B flat is the E flat major chord, and that's the 4 chord. And together these 3 chords, the 1, 4, 5, 1, make up a really nice progression. So you can use the circle of fifths to inform the chords you use like that. And of course, these same relationships work in any key. So let's say we go down to the key of E. So we have E, and in the circle of fifths, the chord, the 5 chord, in a clockwise direction is B major. The 4 chord in a counterclockwise direction is A major, and then back to E major. So E, 5, 4, 1. And just for good measure, let's go through a couple of more chords here. In the key of E flat, for example, we have E flat and E flat, A flat, E flat. So you can go anywhere in the circle of fifths, same patterns apply. So that's a really useful way to think of the circle of fifths as a guide to understanding chords. And the last use of the circle of fifths that we'll look at here is a guide to understanding musical keys, or the 12 keys in music in a special order. Like you saw before, the circle of fifths is built from interlocking major scales. The C major scale leads to G major, the G major scale which leads to the D major scale, etc., all in one big loop. Each of these patterns is almost identical to its neighbors, with one note difference between them. So for example, the C major scale is made from notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. The G major scale is made from notes G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. That F sharp is a little different because it's not included in the C major scale. Then we have the D major scale made from notes D, E, F sharp, G, all notes in the G major scale, and then we have A, B, C sharp, D. So that C sharp is different because that is in the D major scale, and F sharp and C sharp are not in the C major scale. So each of these scales has progressive sharp notes in this case. And this explains why the circle of fifths is often depicted as a wheel of key signatures, where keys with an increasing number of sharps progress in a clockwise direction, and then keys with more and more flats advance in a counterclockwise direction. But now we can use the connection between the circle of fifths and the chromatic scale to understand these keys even better. So when we rotate the circle of fifths into the chromatic scale like this, we basically have the 12 notes arranged in the order they appear on the keyboard, where we have this recognizable pattern of black and white keys with a group of 2 black keys here and a group of 3 black keys here. On an actual keyboard, these same 12 notes are repeated over and over again in different octaves, but in a simple circle like this, it's just the 12 basic notes of the chromatic scale. Okay, so from this we can pick out the notes of, say, the C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And notice that all of the notes in this pattern are white keys. In other words, there are no sharps and no flat notes. And when we rearrange the chromatic scale into the circle of fifths by rotating every other note by 180 degrees so that each pair of complementary colors swaps places, you can see how all the white keys are grouped together like this, while all the black keys are also grouped like this. This section right here is the C major scale, all the white keys, but in a circle of fifths sequence. And then when we rotate it back into the chromatic scale, you can see the familiar interval pattern of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And then again, if we rotate this pattern back into the circle of fifths, you can see that the major scale is just a rearranged segment of the circle of fifths. And let's get it back into the chromatic scale pattern so you can see this as it's normally laid out on the instrument. And of course, it works the same way for all of the keys. So the G major scale looks like this on an instrument with G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. When we rotate this pattern into the circle of fifths, all of the notes are reordered to be neighbors or right next to the notes that are closely related to them. And you can see that in the G major scale, this F sharp note is black. All right, then in the D major scale, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, when we rotate this pattern into the circle of fifths, again, you can see that all of these notes are related because they're neighbors in this pattern, and notes F sharp and C sharp are black in this key. And the same relationship between the circle of fifths and the major scale in each key is consistent. So we can see it in the A major scale, E major, B major, F sharp major, also known as the key of G flat, key of D flat, A flat, E flat, B flat, F, and then back to the key of C. So in this way, the circle of fifths explains why the notes in each key sound good together, why they sound compatible, because each major scale is really just a subset of the circle of fifths that's been rearranged into a chromatic scale pattern, and the major scale is a subset of the chromatic scale. So these relationships inform why scales sound good and different modes that are derived from those scales, and by extension, chords and progressions that also stem from these patterns. Now, as you get deeper into these patterns, the distinction between black and white keys fades into the background and doesn't really mean anything, because what really matters is the relationships between the pitches themselves, which the colors already highlight. And the connections between fifths is only one type of relationship in what's really a symmetrical, geometric web of patterns, all illustrated by the colors as well. But that's beyond the scope of this video, and I cover all of that in other videos. So this is at least an introduction to the circle of fifths, so you know exactly what it is, how it's formed, and how to actually use it in music on real instruments, seeing this pattern as the notes themselves, as chords, or representing entire keys. This pattern is also your gateway to all of the intricate and powerful connections that make all musical patterns possible. So thank you for watching. Let YouTube know if you thought this was a good one. Join the conversation below, and if you'd like to get diagrams and more information on the circle of fifths and all things music theory, definitely check out the color music community at locals.com. There's a link in the notes below, and I will see you in the next video.